Known to one, known to all. An invisible hand. Migration 5. They sound like phrases from a dystopic spy thriller, but they all relate to a secretive network of 5 countries, the US, UK, Australia, Canada and New Zealand, that shares data about millions of people crossing their borders.
This has been a growing and very significant intelligence gathering and data sharing operation that has largely developed over the years under a cloak of secrecy. And it was all operating in a rather murky area where it's completely exempt from the Privacy Act and the way that New Zealanders would expect their data to be treated.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, how RNZ journalist Jill Bonnet broke open Migration 5 and why it is alarming people.
Why do you have curtains on your house? It doesn't matter if you have never done anything wrong and you supposedly have nothing to fear. It's a question of what should your own government be allowed to know about you? And then what should a foreign government be allowed to know about you? And even if those things are justified, why is all this not publicly clear and known and out in the open and vetted by your elected representatives?
It's a story that got politicians' attention at last week's Scrutiny Week.
It's been a long-standing agreement. I don't think there's been any particular secrecy around it. And it's been in place since 2008.
But if, as Immigration Minister Erica Stanford says, there's no secrecy around it, why did Jill Bonnet face obstacle after obstacle in trying to uncover the details? Her years-long investigation eventually took her to Washington, D.C. to talk to those who were there at the start.
There was almost a feeling that they were playing at it, that they saw themselves as kind of pseudo-intelligence officers.
You've obviously talked to a lot of people. Was it mostly off the record?
Entirely off the record.
Really?
Except for people, obviously, who have got concerns in terms of privacy and civil rights and so on. But yes, I think that there's a high level of secrecy and got the impression that it was a group that didn't really want to be known.
We'll hear more about Jill's experiences in DC, but let's go back 5 years when she first came across mention of Migration 5 in a briefing to the Immigration Minister.
I was intrigued, but there was really nothing about it. And I remember putting in a couple of Official Information Act requests for minutes and agendas, and it came back that I couldn't have them on the grounds of international relations. So obviously, as soon as you get told you can't have something, you're very interested in it suddenly. And then there was just a single media release that the Department of Homeland Security put out in America, which went into a little bit more detail. So having kind of hit dead ends, though, in terms of getting a lot of information out about, when it started, what they do, what was its purpose, I kind of thought that I better pursue it a little bit more energetically.
So early on, did you get a sense of how big this was, how significant the story was?
Well, no, because what you don't know, you don't know. I'd always had a sense in the back of my mind that there was an invisible hand above policy on migration because, we had algorithms coming into the system and they would have done eventually anyway. But looking back, there were a lot of things that were probably moved along in New Zealand policy as a result of these collaborations. There were similarities in terms of the fact that legislation in some of the other 5 countries was also going through it, that, at the same time, we were all looking at the same thing, the biometrics and how, making sure that we could legally share that across borders.
Biometrics, can you explain that?
Yeah, so different things in different places. The British use iris scans as well, but we're just fingerprints and photographs. The Americans collect and the Canadians collect a lot more fingerprints. In fact, if you just go on a visit to America, you'll have your fingerprints taken at the border. We don't take fingerprints routinely here, so we've got far fewer. But those that we do have, obviously now we can share. So
explain how Migration 5 expanded, according to your stories, from checking, a few thousand asylum seekers' identities to pretty much the data of everyone who crosses the borders of these nations, these 5 nations.
So it seems, I spoke to someone who was there at the very start of it and was told that It was before 9/11, in fact, that they started to discuss how they could collaborate more deeply. And then obviously when those terrorist attacks happened on 9/11 and in the UK and elsewhere, they started to realise that they wanted to protect their borders, securitise them, and they started off with asylum seekers and what they termed as complex cases, or where there was a concern about people's identity. So it was 3,000 per country per partner. So if you think about all the different permutations of that, 3,000 becomes 60,000. And then that quite quickly increased. And then there's been automation since, which has enabled them to get their service level agreements to a maximum of 400,000 per partner per year. But there's also a clause in it that says that they can raise that by mutual consent. These numbers can move at any time.
What Jill's saying there is that the number of travellers having their data shared has gone from a few thousand to several 100,000. Erica Stanford told last week's Select Committee M5 has a crucial role to play in difficult times.
We are operating now more than ever in a very, very high-risk environment. More asylum claims, more high-risk cases. And there is, we need to make sure that our borders are not compromised. And so being able to share information with our partners is a crucial part of making sure we're keeping New Zealanders safe and ensuring the integrity of our borders.
What's behind it? Is it about security, or is it about illegal border crossing, catching criminals? What is the aim of Migration 5?
So they would also say that it's to do with facilitating genuine travellers, so that people can move faster through the airports and that they won't get held up so much. By being able to do that, they'll be able to then concentrate on the riskier people that they just want to check a little bit more deeply. In doing the information sharing, they would be able to possibly find that there was something untruthful about an asylum seeker's story, and be able to say, well, while you were being persecuted in Sri Lanka, you clearly weren't, because you were a student in Canada. That was the purpose. That's what it set out to do. But I suppose there's always the little mission creep, isn't there? And it must be quite administratively convenient to be able to check to see if anybody's had any issues in terms of overstaying or had a visa rejection somewhere else, that another country can then, say, well, if Australia's turned you down, then we're going to turn you down. And so I think that's how it grew.
How do they access or share and access this information? Is it all stored in one central?
No. It's started off as what they call the High Value Data Sharing Protocol, and that was a server that was hosted by Australia. But when they moved on to this automated system, they've kept the information in their own countries, and the country that's requesting information sends a set of fingerprints automatically to the country that it wants the information from, and then that country goes to see if they have a match, and if they don't, they destroy the fingerprints so that they're not accumulating other people's biometrics. And then if they do find information, then they through secure channels send it back to the country that requested it.
Immigration New Zealand head Alison McDonald last week told MPs that so far this year the agency has received more than 700,000 requests and matched 185 people. It has requested biometric information from 865 people from its M5 partners and received data on a quarter of them, but sometimes mistakes are made.
There have been several examples in my tenure where we've done that, issued a notice to someone where perhaps we've declined a application and subsequently approved it. We've then gone on to give person a letter to take with them in case there's any border stops.
The information that they are in the agreements that they've agreed to share are things like travel records, but also medical records, family members' names, details of trips that people have taken. I think people would be quite surprised to find out that there was that level of detail kept data about them, and then that could be shared with another country.
So are you talking about information that they have on you or I?
Well, I can't speak for you because, but for me, I was a resident visa holder here for a number of years. So yes, it could even be me, because residents are not citizens, and therefore we do have our data. It mentions an agreement between, for example, New Zealand and Canada, where it stated that no citizens of either country would have their data shared. And then for Canada, it specifically said, and permanent residents. And we didn't have the same little exemption for our 1 million residents.
Okay, so can I just clarify here? This information isn't about the citizens of each of these 5 nations.
I still think it's a little bit murky, to be honest, because, for example, the agreement between New Zealand and America makes it clear that we can share citizen status under certain circumstances. But Immigration New Zealand is quite adamant that it does not, and that no Migration 5 members share their own citizen status. There was a little exchange of notes between embassies, between the UK and the US, that I found, where it did seem to expand it to cover citizens. So it's just, I guess, that in the crannies and the nooks, there are all these little tidbits of information that suggests that citizens can have their information shared. And also, for example, you're on a New Zealand passport, but you've been to the UK and now you're going to Canada. Can the UK and Canada share your information, because neither of them is a country that you're a citizen of?
We don't know. It's not clear.
There's a lot we don't know.
Wow. There's even a slogan. I mean, you came across the slogan for Migration 5, known to one, known to all.
Yes, it sounds a bit creepy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Back in the day after 9/11, America had a policy called Total Information Awareness, and they realised that sounded quite dystopian and actually changed it. You can understand what they're trying to get at. If they think that if everybody that has ever been crossed a border can become known to the other countries, then they will never have a criminal be able to go into, for example, into a second Five Eyes country, or, and never a terrorist to be able to pass into another country if there's already information in one of those 5. So I do see how this organisation came about and its rationale. You can understand that in those times, especially, in the 2000s, when there were so many terrorist attacks, and people were worried about the security of the border, there were a lot more asylum seekers. We had Syria happen. There were, lots of concerns during that time period about whether we would ever be able to catch people at the border who were going to do us bad. So the known to one, known to all, it does sound spooky, strange, dystopian slightly, but it is exactly what they're trying to achieve, that if you've crossed one border and done something wrong there, then the other 4 partners will be able to check that and know not to let that person in. The issues come, I suppose, in terms of whether people should know that exists, and also then comes in terms of privacy and what happens when there are mistakes.
What's the problem here? Because we all want to be secure, right, in our own countries. We all want to feel safe. So what are people saying that's so wrong with it?
So the concerns that people have expressed to me are around what happens with the data and what happens if there are mistakes.
People who aren't bad actors per se may get a bad mark on their record. And I can only imagine if that happens in that system, how difficult, if not impossible, it would be to scrub that kind of information or to ever redeem yourself. And so that also, I feel for anyone who is stuck in that situation.
What happens if somebody hacks the system? How long do you keep the data for? They're not just keeping the data of the bad guys and then checking between themselves on the bad guys. They're keeping everybody's. So it's kind of like being in a police lineup, really, except that you don't know that you're in the lineup, and you're there for quite a number of years. America keeps their data for 75 years.
So someone's lifetime.
Yeah.
Who is most vulnerable here? Is it a new migrant? Is it an asylum seeker? Is it people from certain countries?
Those who are more vulnerable would be asylum seekers. So people who travel to a country and claim asylum when they're there. Their information can be checked back with the other 4 partners. And at that stage, the concerns that people have told me about, if there was false or mistaken information, and of course in New Zealand we've had cases where there's been deliberately seeded false information that could be passed to a partner, could be passed via a third country to one of the 5 countries.
Yeah, so it could potentially ruin someone's life.
It can ruin lives in different ways, I think. I mean, if you were a parent trying to visit your children, your adult children in one of the 5 countries, and there was a slip-up, that's still a serious consequence, not being able to go and see them. Obviously, when you get to asylum seekers, those can be very fatal consequences.
How widely known is Migration 5 beyond our spy agencies and our top-level immigration people? Who knew about it?
I found it incredibly hard to find people that knew about it. There is basically one expert who knows part of the jigsaw puzzle in each of the 5 countries as it happens. And so we compared notes. We found a little bit more about the history of it and details like that, but there's still quite a lot that we don't know.
So what was the reaction of people that you talked to?
Privacy experts have been quite horrified at the extent of the data sharing. I think the question is really, if we didn't know what we didn't know about this up to this point, what's to say that it wouldn't then keep increasing?
Yeah.
Who's to say that there would ever be a limit on it? If you take it to the extreme, we would join up our knowledge with that of the EU and we would kind of create some worldwide network. That would be scary, wouldn't it? But if we'd not known about this at the start and imagined the Five Eyes collecting this migration data, I think people would have been concerned.
You've gone to politicians, and when you've approached them, government ministers or officials, what have they told you?
The really interesting thing about this group is that it's underpinned by administrative memorandums of understanding. They don't need legislation to pass. They don't need a politician to sign them. So politicians themselves have had very little input into this. Obviously, they were the ones who enabled it when the biometric sharing question came up 15 years ago. But beyond that, the immigration minister who was in charge during a large part of the 2010s, Michael Woodhouse, said it really hadn't come across his radar while he was minister. The rest of the memorandums have been signed by officials, and they meet kind of 10 times a year, and they have remote meetings and working group meetings. When I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., the guy that I spoke to had just come back from Australia where he'd been there as part of Migration 5. So it's a very busy group.
This investigation took you to Washington. What were you able to find out there that you couldn't access here?
So I hit a dead end, really, when I was trying to get this information through journalistic means. And so I approached the Fulbright to see if I could get a scholarship. And I went to Washington, D.C. For 4 months and had a great deal of success in being able to talk to people who were involved and access contacts within the system there to be able to just really get a sense of what it was about and also just get those kind of documents that I hadn't been able to access here.
Which surprises me, actually, because we all think of the US as being so almost paranoid, so security conscious. But did you find it quite accessible?
I think that there's a big difference between a security conscious country and people who are actually very open to ideas and debate. And so I spoke to diplomats who were talking about, the purposes of the organisation and, very willing to talk about why they think that is the way ahead. The idea that you don't want to stop people at airports. Ideally, if you're going to have stopped them, you'll have stopped them in their living room while they were applying.
What kind of institutions did you get into?
Well, because these are officials-led organisations, it was talking to those people who had been in the room when these early talks were going on. Who've been in those kind of decision-making roles at that level, diplomatic circles who are also part of this immigration liaison network.
And of all the people that you talked to, who surprised you the most or shocked you the most?
I think when I was talking to people from the early days, just finding out those kind of details about how it all started out and where they met and what the purpose was and how they kind of egged each other on a little bit. The way it was described to me, the UK and Australia were always the ones who were pushing harder for action on migration. But obviously after the terrorist attacks in America, then the US really took that driving force. And in fact, New Zealand was a late arrival. We didn't join, we were the last to join. Part of that is really quite trying to understand that, say, America or Australia, maybe with the number of boat people that they had, or the UK with the number of asylum seekers and migrants they have there, you could kind of understand their motivation in joining a group like this. But several people I spoke to said we were never quite so sure about why New Zealand would be involved.
And these people that you talked to who were in early on, were they like high-level officials?
Yes, so they'd been there and had some quite sharp words to say actually about different people who had also been in those meetings.
Sharp words.
In terms of, how can I say this? There was almost a feeling that they were playing at it, that they saw themselves as kind of pseudo-intelligence officers.
As a result of your stories and the fact that it has been brought up at the Select Committee during Scrutiny Week, are we likely to have more transparency on Migration 5?
I really hope so, because it isn't. There are probably some really good aspects to it in terms of being able to increase security and be able to work on things together that make sense to work on together. Immigration policy is hard to collaborate on, I think, between countries because it's such a very intrinsic part of a country's sovereignty that I don't think that they felt that they could do that out in the open. And I think that's how these organisations have come about, really, that they, are kind of more informal channels of being able to just say, oh, we've had this policy and this happened, you might, and then you might think about sharing that knowledge and using that information to do something similar in your own country. There probably are a lot of positives, but without knowing what they do, not having, audits of the data sharing and not being able to get readily available figures about what they do, and crucially to have those agreements out in the open because they're not even published in New Zealand.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Jill Bonnet. I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Ka kite anō.